Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I'm your host and a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective. For today's episode, I met with LAP editors and frequent guests to the show, Joana Salém Vasconcelos and Andrew Smolski, as well as first-time guest and LAP editor Daniela García Grandón, to discuss their exciting new January 2024 issue of LAP, The Agrarian Question as an Ecological Question. Daniela García Grandón is a part-time professor in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies at the University of Ottawa. Joana Salém Vasconcelos is a full-time visiting professor at Federal University of UFABC in Brazil, and she has a PhD in economic history from the University of Sao Paulo. And Andrew Smolski is an assistant professor of rural sociology in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education at the Pennsylvania State University. Good morning.
Morning. That's a nice microphone.
It is. The perks of having Ron's credit card.
Is that what does it?
Yeah.
Hello,
Hey,
everyone.
Danny.
Hi, Daniela. How are you?
Doing good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Hi, Joanna.
Hi.
Thanks for making it.
How are you?
Good. Welcome to the show. I know Andy and Joanna really well, but I'm really excited that you're here, Daniela, as LAP coordinating editor and new guest to the podcast. So thanks for making time to come today. Now, I sent y'all a list of pretty detailed questions, but I actually, before we jump into those, I just had an additional question I wanted to ask about. Just if you could briefly summarize the main theme of the issue and how it was that all three of y'all put this thing together.
So this issue really was built around a shared question linking together questions about the environment, environmental degradation, sustainability, although that's kind of a contested term, and political economy, right? Which is really a driving force behind Latin American perspectives. And we all had a shared interest at the intersection of those pieces of political economy and the environment. We had a shared interest in terms of Latin America and agri-food systems. And, we had really an opportunity to come together around that and develop this thematic issue. And I would say even more than that, we had aspirations of bringing into this issue vantage points from, feminist scholarship, from questions around indigenous struggles that aren't always put on the table or centered in discussions around environmental political economy. And so we wanted to do that as well. And to the extent that we were able, we accomplished that goal, but we recognize that future issues should really build on that even more.
Yeah.
Right.
I really appreciate Andy's words. And for me, what it motivates me more, and I think it's a shared motivation about this special issue, is kind of the sociological critique as part of the Agrarian Question, that I think it was needed and around this debate, and kind of this counter narrative that emerged criticizing the ecological and social consequences of agrarian modernization wasn't really addressed, there is still room for keep exploring that at this point in time. So that was kind of, I think, a shared motivation about the issue, along with what Andy is saying very well about this.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Also, I want to add that we three, I'm Joana, Andy, and Daniela, we have different backgrounds from our academic training. I am an economic historian and had also studied a lot agrarian geography. And Andy and Daniela are sociologists with different paths. And it was very interesting to share our bibliography and see it could be very interestingly connected, especially how the so-called old agrarian question can be connected to the updated political economy of 21st century capitalism and the political ecology studies. And I think that is this issue contributes to systematize some connections and updates on this agrarian ecological question under the climate change shadow. So that is
Right.
also important.
I appreciate you talking about your different disciplinary training and differences. I'm trained as a sociologist, but compared to Joanna or to Andy and Daniela, I'm not that type of sociologist at all. I actually don't know that much about the agrarian question, the agrarian issue. And after I read Joanna's book and a number of the articles in this issue, I was like, oh man, I need to learn a lot more about this. This is a weak point for me personally as a scholar. So I'm really excited about this issue for that reason. And I'm hoping that we can unpack a little today this issue of agrarianism and what is the agrarian question? This is a really important theme and idea in Latin American studies, Latin American political economy. So I'm hoping we can unpack that and what are the key tenets of the classical debate before we move on to maybe more contemporary issues.
I think there is many possibilities to answer what is the agrarian question. And I think regarding my studies that the agrarian question can be summarized as a concept or an expression used by Latin American critical thinkers and also by social movements from the global south to address especially the agrarian structure of peripheral and new colonial economies. Also, it can be used to address the agrarian structure of the core capitalism situations in countries. But I think that it was mainly used to address the peripheral situation. It involves, for example, land concentration, monoculture, labor violence, unproductive fields, speculative dynamics integrated in the international markets using land. It also talks about how the capitalist modernization affect the colonial structure of our societies. And I think that the agrarian question in the 20th century was necessarily attached to the theories of underdevelopment and dependency scopes, especially in Latin American agrarian economies and all its global effects in our societies. For example, structural unemployment, the relations between the countryside and the urban economies, and the demographical transition when the most part of Latin American populations turn to be urban, labor exploitation in the urban activities regarding the land concentration as a consequence of land concentration, capital's dependency, and many other categories that were embedded within the development and dependency theories. I would highlight three problems triggered by this expression, agrarian question. First, the land concentration. Second, the monoculture. And third, labor violence. Definitely, I think it involves also ecological destruction in any historical period we can have. But the agrarian question as an ecological question is a frame that scholars and social movements started to have just in the 21st century. So although all agrarian questions have to do with ecological destruction in Latin America, addressing this problem as a research problem or a struggle problem in terms of social movement, political consciousness is a more recent perspective on this issue.
So thinking about this in terms of politics and social movements, I would like us to unpack a little bit more of aspects of the classical debate with regard to campesinos and peasants in Latin America and how they've been framed by what you could call traditional or orthodox Marxist approaches to political economy and politics in the 20th century, as well as how they were framed by more, you could say, liberal theories of modernization, of capitalist modernization, right? And what have been the historical problems with these different framings, whether it's intellectually, historically, or politically? I would like to hear some of y'all's thoughts on that.
So I really love when it feels like the conversation is scaffolding, because that's
Right.
what really happening. I was writing down notes from what Daniela and Joana were saying. And so I think the way we could really conceptualize this, and it animated a lot of my own thinking, is about how early Marxist approaches, or I think you use the term orthodox, which I always find fun because it seems like it has a little pejorative to it.
Yeah, it definitely does. I'm not sure I ascribe to that pejorative, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, this is just a tad. But I mean, there was what we call in the introduction kind of productivism, right? An orientation towards industrial modes and means of production as a good in and of themselves. And if you start from that premise, there's a lot of things in terms of agriculture that will follow, because technological intensification, oftentimes, at least over the 20th century, required things that Joanna already put on the table, like land consolidation, right? Because if you're going to put a bunch of money into a giant combine, then you're going to want certain geographies and topographies to be able to use that tractor. This is why you could even see parallels between Soviet Union forms of doing agriculture and United States forms of doing agriculture. James Scott, who I know is in a little bit of disrepute because of his early CIA days, but he points out, right, Soviet planners were looking towards the United States and 3,000 acre fields of wheat as a model. So orthodox thinking in terms of Marxism, had that orientation. We could see it in the State and Revolution, with Lenin in his discussion of, the relationship of the peasantry to the state and to the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? They're a subsumed class. And in a sense, they're a class that doesn't have to remain if we're going to be able to feed the revolution. And I don't want to overdo it. I don't think Lenin is calling for like some kind of end of the peasantry or something like that. But there was a belief that industrial development was going to pull to the future. And then you add in like liberals like W.W. Rostow and the Kennedy administration with a similar vantage point, right? Danny said
Right.
agrarian modernization. Modernization theory, I think, is a key way of also thinking about this, that like having smallholder farms, village communes, what Marx in his later days in the 1880s, before he passes away, is looking towards the Obshchina and the Mir in Russia, that those can disappear, because for the liberals, it's also about technology, industrialization, expansion, and what I think it's Earl Butz at the USDA would say, go big or go home, right? So there's a lot of just shared framings that nowadays we can say are problematic, but maybe if we were in that time as well, we wouldn't have automatically seen as problematic. We would have been techno-optimists,
Right.
because it seemed like the proper thing to do: expand yield, address food insecurity, and utilize the surplus to develop your industrial base. And that way you deal with the problems of underdevelopment and dependency. Yeah.
Can I add something? I also want
Please.
to add, I think, in this perspective of and the reflections, the early work of Chayanov in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, because he was a geographist that deals with the first formulations of what should be the peasant economy. And his concepts and his ideas were kind of defeated by this orthodox Marxism that came to be the large-scale land concentrated farm in the Soviet Union. But he has had a very interesting perspective about the importance of autonomies in the peasantry economy. And it all came up like 1 century before. And it's very interesting when some author or some intellectual have a very defeated thought and minority, and then 100 years before that, after that, I mean, it just came up and embodied in some social movements. And I think that also part of our reflections in the introduction of how peasant economies could be thought as alternatives or self-management forms of production, cooperative forms of production, and also experiment different social technologies in alternatives to this hegemonical modernization that it's also destructive in terms of ecology.
Oh, awesome. That was really, really informative. Now, I had a follow-up question, but I think y'all pretty much covered it. So thinking about how, in the introduction, you point to around the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, there's a departure from, at least within academic circles and some political circles, there's a departure from this traditional Marxist approach to agriculture and the peasantry, as well as the modernization approach, right? The capitalist modernization approach. And you see sort of an alternative vision and an alternative approach to organize a political economy that's characterized by these agrarian reform projects in different parts of Latin America. I'm hoping we could speak to some of these different sort of agrarian reforms that took place in the 20th century. And in general, what were the different projects and forms that this took? And what were some commonalities and differences that we can point to?
Yes, that's really my main topic of study during my master's degree and my PhD dissertation. Especially, I studied the Cuban and the Chilean agrarian reform. And also it reflects a sort of Latin American agrarian reform moment, exactly on these decades you mentioned it, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Agrarian reform basically come from everywhere, bottom up, top down, and all sides, because we have like peasantry movements, very organized. Indeed, there is an interesting article by Aníbal Quijano about what he tried to do a sort of typology of peasantry movements from that time, because peasantry movements during this period, these decades, were very plural and diverse. And they have like, some of them have more religious background, also have, others have more political party engagement. Some of them were very attached with the socialist and communist agendas, but others were like indigenous and had this epistemological different approach about the land and about what earth mean, what Mother Earth mean. And it was a diverse context. And also in that period, the United Nations system created, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization and other organisms that were internationally concerned with the agrarian reform in the peripheral capitalism, to avoid, mainly to avoid social explosions as the Cuban Revolution was. And so we had the Kennedy Alliance for Progress and the United States Agrarian Reform for Latin America. there was many different types of agrarian reform. I think that we can classify it in maybe 4 or 5 types of agrarian reform. First, an agrarian reform that we can call like technocratical and oligarchical, because it has no expropriation of latifundia, of land, basically. It was much more like a synonym to modernization of production, to avoid this criticism on non-productive big extensions of land regarding the land concentration situation. So the elites had also their agrarian reform project as a response of all this social effervency. Also, there is the very dominant CEPAL agrarian reform project, much more attached to an structuralist approach on the economy and Latin American structuralism, thinking about how to civilize peripheral capitalism, how to create cheap internal markets of food, diversifying the production, and feeding the working class in the new industrial urban centers. And this project was very strong in different governments of Latin America, from Eduardo Frei in Chile to João Goulart in Brazil, that couldn't do it because there was the coup d'etat that stopped it. But also like Velasco Alvarado in Peru, he has also some sort of influence of the agrarian reform in a structuralist way of seeing things, because it was very dominant. And we also had, of course, the socialist and communist approach that sometimes were allied with social peasantry and social movements from the peasantry organizations. But it was not homogeneous. It was very complex. Sometimes the relationship between political parties from the left wing in Latin America and peasantry movements were not like harmonical, was conflictive, because also there was epistemological differences, including considering this response that Andy gave first about how Orthodox Marxism sometimes saw the peasantry as backwardness sign. And so it was a very complex and agitated period. And we can say that there was also one last agrarian reform project that was indeed a counter agrarian reform project, because after some structuralists and sometimes with socialist features, agrarian reforms were made. Also, there was coup d'etat that had unmade it and done it. And there were a lot of counter agrarian reform that was based in the modernization pattern, but to restore the land concentration from the period before. So it was a very complex period.
Thank you for detailing a lot of that complexity. We don't have enough time to get in depth in it, but I think the listeners will appreciate the picture that you've painted thus far. Now, in the introduction, y'all point to this issue, this moment, this movement of the Green Revolution with regard to agrarianism and agricultural reform. I'm curious to hear more about what this was, the Green Revolution, and what have been the ecological and social, political consequences of it.
Yeah, following on what my co-author have said, and come back into this concept of agricultural modernization, the Green Revolution was basically this effort, right, to impose an agricultural modernization in the mid-20th century. So what it was the most important issues was this introduction of industrial technologies, high yield crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, mechanized farming, as Andy was mentioning. So initially, so they wanted to increase agricultural productivity to combat hunger, social issues, right? And that was the excuse that exactly became this model of capitalism and many times also socialist agricultural policies. Developmentalist approaches also are very in line with this promotion of, particularly during the mid-century, emphasizing this agricultural modernization to the adoption of green revolution technologies, including especially high yield crop varieties, right? And what are the main social consequences? I guess displacement and urbanization, or accelerated urbanization. These mechanized farming marginalizes small scale farmers, peasants, what is called the family farms, maybe if you want to call like that, and led to depopulation in many places. In Mexico, for example, rural communities were displaced by land concentration, as many places in Latin America. Concentration of wealth. That is a main issue, of course, and we are going to maybe talk about that later in our neoliberalism question. But so one of the benefits of this green revolution were largely captured by these agribusiness and wealthy landowners that paved the way with what is come, right? In Brazil, agribusiness alliances expand their control, right, greatly. Another consequence, important consequence, is the erosion of traditional practices. And I think our issue brings light about this. Traditional knowledge and agricultural, agroecological methods were diminished greatly in favor of these industrial practices, which is one of the main problems and one of the main issues that affected whole Latin America, and what is actually happened now, right? In Guatemala, for example, has impacted greatly the lack of this importance of the knowledge and the method that they use, and where their reliance on chemical intensive crops has been very aggressive. And of course, the ecological consequences, right? The soil degradation, the water degradation, the widespread use of this agrochemical contaminate the vital water resources and reduce soil fertility in many, many places along Latin America. The loss of biodiversity that we have seen extensively, this shift to monocultures in Colombia, for example, with palm oil, it's been very aggressive and very violent. And of course, climate impact, right? The land conversion to monoculture expansions in many countries, Argentina, Guatemala, and everywhere, really significant carbon emissions that we also are aware and don't deal directly in this issue, but we know that is a big consequence, right, of this revolution.
Just a quick additional comment here, and I'm in agreement, with everything that Danny is putting forward about the Green Revolution. Just to provide that the peasantry, smallholder farmers, medium-scale farmers, they also pushed for these things in certain instances, right? And
right, that's important.
Like, agriculture is incredibly labor intensive. It can be incredibly brutal on the body, right? Certain technologies like irrigation or pesticides, can resolve certain problems that farmers and peasants confront. And I think about our colleague who has passed away, Romina Ruvalcaba, whose work on the rancheros in Mexico was centering that part, right? Like, the modernization project is also a project of a certain group of the peasants. And so when we put these issues on the table, right, like us as editors of this issue, what we were also trying to deal with was that kind of contradiction. Like what is the alternative? And this might be getting ahead of ourselves, but what is the alternative that we can propose that isn't just like, hey, let's go and do something really arduous? Because even for peasantries that have access to common land that they won't be dispossessed of, have an issue of reproducing the next generation of farmers, right? So it's like the Green Revolution, it was playing on a certain desire, and that's something we gotta also grapple with.
No, I appreciate the nuance to that question. I also appreciate you bringing up Romina. May she rest in peace. An incredible scholar and member of LAP who's no longer with us. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to bring up, right? There's different stakeholders here and different motivations, and it's not just a top-down process inherently, right? There are power dynamics at play, capital, U.S. imperialism, things like that. But yeah, like working class people, peasant people have a diversity, a plurality, as Joana said, right? So that's important to point out. Now, Danny alluded to this earlier, and anybody who listens to this podcast knows I'm probably going to bring up neoliberalism at some point. So if these processes are sort of maybe not initiated, but ramped up and amplified, these processes of monocrop agriculture, right, of land displacement, of maybe in a lot of instances state violence, right, to facilitate this process. What's been the significance of neoliberalism over the past 40, maybe approaching 50 years now since the onset of neoliberalism for agriculture, for resistance movements to some of these issues? One thing I found really intriguing in the introduction that I'm going to go look a lot more into is this issue of the merging of agriculture with like technologies of war and industries of war and the chemical industrial complex. So if we could like briefly touch upon that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and that is very interesting and kind of follow up or discusses or go hand in hand with what Andy says about technology, right? Because technology is really an issue that is not, I mean, farmers, of course, need technology, everyone, because it's labor intensive, but what type of technology? And these questions about agriculture and war chemical industry complex is really tying to that, right? How we use or utilize technology and who has the power to impose what technology we use and how we produce it and how it is designed, right? And this adoption of the agrochemical technologies, which are the most significant during this time, is how neoliberalism and their policies facilitated the entry of this to their objectives, to this project, right? That it means many different things, but and how this corporativization and chemical corporations like Monsanto, as we know, Bayer, Syngenta, developed those products, initially developed for military purposes, right? The Orange Agent, the most well-known case used in warfare, became the basis for herbicides. Applied to these monocultures that we so much talked about it, right? The also expansion of GMOs, and not every GMO or specifically damaging modified crops that tied to proprietary agrochemical inputs, land grabbing, and neoliberal policies incentivize this agribusiness company, the wealth concentration of them, and the corporativization of and the facilitation of this corporativization of agribusinesses to expand with the monoculture exports, with different dynamics of displacement of especially indigenous communities in many places. The Colombian palm oil is a really good example of this as well. And that not only have these huge ecological damages, also rural violence, of course. Great environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, as we already have said, but also these processes have although it is very contagious and not straightforward, an important resistance, right? During this process of neoliberalization, this violence that this whole process entails because of displacement, because of imposition, because of the change of the modes of life, because of the lack of knowledge or the valorization of traditional knowledge entails, has brought up important resistance movements, right? And this alternative, or one of the most powerful alternatives, that is agroecology. That these organizations like La Via Campesina, right, resisted land concentration, advocated for agroecology as a powerful alternative to what is happening, emphasizing food sovereignty and the integration of indigenous knowledge, which I think is that is some of the issues that is very problematic. A new way of seeing the model, right? So what is the model that we want? How we name that? And that is something that La Via Campesina has tried to address, because it's not easy, especially for small resistant movements that we can criticize because of the adoption of, I don't know, the ideologies or whatever, right? But this idea of, for example, buen vivir, help us to change our minds in kind of what is the focus that we want instead of growth, right? Economic growth. What is it there? What is about that we can do differently in our lives, and how we can put that emphasis in a different way of living. And that is, of course, key part of the eco-territorial struggles and the different nuances between different people, different places, the fights again among them, and again in Colombia, fights against different groups, indigenous, Black groups, small farmers are not all the same, and these imply very different interests sometimes, many commonalities, but that is not an easy thing. There are a lot of struggles that are also part of these resistant movements that are tied to our neoliberal policies and the way as we live. So yeah, and I'm not going to keep extending on this, but definitely neoliberalism has deepened the integration of the agriculture and the war and chemical industrial complex, right? And that has many consequences, exacerbating these ecological destruction, social inequalities, of course, poverty, poverty and the social relationship, right? El tejido social. Yeah, but however, that also has sparked a lot of different acts of consciousness and different type of groups that now have to respond to that. Thank you.
Before I know Joanna's got a lot that she would like to add and build on from what Danny was saying about indigenous resistance, but Danny said something that I really love and find important about technology and like what we build, what we use, who decides, and they're all already alternatives. You know, say for instance in Cuba, during the 80s, the Cuban government started to invest in these centers for entomophages and entomopathogens. Basically, what these are is they can be like either parasitoid wasps. So I love to talk about these because it just gets to how crazy nature could be. But you know, you can control herbivorous insects by releasing parasitoids into greenhouses, etc., that then implant their eggs inside of these herbivorous insects, specifically larvae that are eating the plants. You can also develop bacterias and fungi, etc., that can do things in ways that are less harmful than the chemical controls that we're utilizing that Danny was linking, you know, with the military-industrial complex. So there are alternatives. They have to be invested in, though, so that they can be upscaled and utilized by peasants and farmers. It can't just be like one-off things, or it can't be the expectation that we have, at least in my view, that social movements will have to carry that forward. and do those kinds of investments with the meager funds that social movements often have to operate with. So I just wanted to bring that in because that is an alternative technology base that exists, and there are examples of how to upscale that already in Latin America and the Caribbean. Joanna, over to you.
Well, I think that adding to what you have already reflected, there is a moment when peasantry movements shifted to a sort of ecological shift of peasantry movements. And I think with that, I can answer a bit the next question. We have a script. So I think that this ecological shift of the peasant movements is precisely located on the 90s. Not because that wasn't before some ecological agendas of peasantry movements. I think that they were much more weak and maybe not systematized as a global project or a strategical project with a total view of the capitalist problem. But in the 90s, we have the creation of Via Campesina and also the creation of CLOC, the Coordinadora Latinoamericana de Organizaciones Campesinas, that came to be. Today, CLOC has almost 30 years of life and more than 85 peasantry organizations in 18 countries. So it reflects this plurality I have mentioned before, and how the peasantry movement started to be in the 90s a sort of vanguard in the ecological debates together with the indigenous movements, because of course there is many differences and epistemological nuances between we can call peasantry movements and indigenous movements, but many indigenous also identify themselves as peasants. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they have common problems and common conceptions of nature, of technology, and of how this green revolution, so-called green revolution, harmed them. They were the victims of the same process. So maybe, as Andy was saying before, there was part of the peasantry movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that were enthusiastic about the modernization of the agrarian production. But in the 90s, it was very clear already that the so-called modernization was very controversial to peasant production. And meanwhile, the large farms could use the soil and contaminate the soil and change their crops in extensive methods. The small peasants cannot do it because they just destroy their own land and they have nowhere to go with these fertilizers. And so the concentration of land, as Danny was saying, was pretty much intensified by the Green Revolution. So this pack of technology from war to agriculture was kind of accelerated the neo-colonial dynamics and the land concentration, because peasants had no alternative when they destroy their own land with those chemicals. And this ecological shift, I think it produced new alliances between peasants and indigenous communities. It was very interesting. And regarding Cuba, I think it is a vanguard in the agroecological movement. But firstly, as Andy know pretty well, because it's his dissertation topic, firstly, agroecology in Cuba was much more emergency and a need than a planned production program. because there were no money to import anymore with the collapse of Soviet Union, the collapse of Cuban economy, the special period and all of that. There was no more money to import all this technology from the Green Revolution pack. And they have to deal with the emergency need of producing food with traditional methods, and also creating new methods. But I think that soon Cuban state realized it was a very important tool of food sovereignty. So the state in Cuba started to fund initiatives of agroecology, especially vehiculated by the Asociación Nacional de Agricultores Pequeños. And also they created the Movimiento Agroecológico Campesino a Campesino, agroecological movement peasant to peasant, that is basically a very horizontal way of sharing social technology of production with very few resources in terms of financial capacity. And then in the 2000s, I think that MST was the main movement, like MST in Brazil was the vanguard in terms of political generalization of the agroecology as topic number 1 of the agrarian change program. So, of course, CLOC is a very important articulation, but MST, as the biggest peasantry movement in Latin America, had this protagonism, I say. Also making some help in technical terms, some left-wing governments that had food sovereignty problems, as Venezuela. So there is, since 2006, MST brigade called Apolonio de Carvalho that helps Venezuelan government in terms of technological production in agroecology base. And MST started to be not only a movement who occupied latifundia, but also and especially a movement who dispute productive paradigms. And that's very interesting because it was not obvious that it could happen when we remember what was the main polemics in the 20th century that was regarded with property. Of course, property is still a main polemic, but not only that, because for many times, as we said before, for decades, it was thought that the capitalists and socialists could share technology, or that the Green Revolution could be used by the Red Revolution, we can say like that. And with the time and the developing of the ecological crisis, I think that that peasant movements were able to teach intellectuals of how it was impossible to use the Green Revolution as a paradigm. Although in Latin America, there are still very relevant and maybe hegemonic intellectual field that believe in modernization of agrarian technology. It's not a gain battle in terms of hegemony in the intellectual environment. I think that to end this reflection, I would like to add that we have 3 parts of our issue, and the biggest part indeed is about peasant and indigenous territorial struggles. And we have research about territorial struggles in Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia. We have 2 manuscripts, 2 articles about Bolivia. We have about 2 articles about territorial struggles, peasantry and indigenous territorial struggles in Chile, and 1 about Brazil. So it's a very diverse panel of territorial struggle and how peasantry could advance in these agendas.
Thank you for that. Now, I know we're about at time and we got to wrap up. Thank you for giving the little layout of the issue. Now, are there any articles that y'all would like to plug that you found particularly interesting? I read part of Andy's article with, I think it was Timothy Clark, that was really fascinating. But there are any others? I haven't been able to read through the whole issue. But are there any others y'all would like to plug?
I do. I think, and this article is great because it brings us a different perspective into the issue. But also, I think another one that brings us a different perspective, or slightly different, is the Nahuara, Los Campesinos y Hacemos Agroecología. That is, I think I would like to highlight that today because it is an article that talked about this group, La Alianza, which is a campesino organization in Venezuela, right? They use this metaphor as symphonies that the author illustrate this group trajectory in resisting corporate agriculture and promoting autonomous livelihoods in a more sustainable and knowledge-based, traditional knowledge-based life way of live, right? They through these specific events, they like the foundation of cooperatives, the creation of the Maestro Pueblo, which is like considered like a collective educational figure. This group reclaim their territories, material and symbolically. And I think what is the most kind of important part of the contribution of this article is that not only talked about the ecologically and socially agroecology transformative potential, but the kind of psychosocial processes that is behind campesino to campesino, which is not as we sometimes intellectual kind of think about it from our intellectual perspective. And they really try to bring up the voice of this group. And I think that effort make this issue better and contribute to a different way of treat research in this area, which I think I really appreciate of this and listen to this article that do that.
Joanna had, and I was also bringing up Cuba, and I think it gets to something central in terms of two contradictions, thinking in a very Marxist way, the totality, right? And the internal contradictions of the totality.
Dialectical totality. Yeah.
Yeah. One of those articles is on the Morales administration and the fact that, right, you can have a state with a normative framework that centers ecology, but then in actual practice can continue to promote agricultural modernization, and not because, and I think the simple example, simple kind of response is, oh, it's hypocrisy, but rather instead to think about what like Danny has been talking about with neoliberalization, what Joanna was putting on the table in terms of dealing with dependency, is like they have to navigate a world of capital accumulation. They have to navigate a world in which food security is real, right? Like that, the system will starve you, so to speak, if we want to grant the system agency. So reading an article like that to understand that kind of contradiction that movements, states, and capital are all kind of battling around. And so the reason why I said the Cuba piece is because there's an article in here, Food Security, Food Sovereignty, and Urban Agriculture in Cuba. And the author, Hugo Gori, I think, through interviews brings up a fact that, like, if you're asking people participating in urban agriculture, which is one front of agroecology, right, why they're doing it, what they were stating was they were often talking about it in terms of food security and not food sovereignty. So it's another one of these contradictions, the way that socioeconomic well-being and environmental sustainability are in contradiction, and it gets to that thing between extractivism and resource nationalism that Latin American Perspectives has put on the table in other issues and other books. And we as scholars, as participants in social struggle, we have to grapple with that and find ways to move forward that are positive and demonstrate concrete capacity for buen vivir, as Danny was bringing up in other articles. So I just wanted to put that on the table real fast.
Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for bringing that up. Joanna, sorry.
Sorry, I would like to add also that we have a methodological challenge in this issue that it must be highlighted, because the agrarian question is necessarily a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary scholarship. And so we have historians, sociologists, economists, geographists, anthropologists that send us works, and each field has proper methods, and it was kind of a challenge for us to deal with these different approaches. And I think in terms of methodological approaches, the issue is also very diverse, because we have all these social sciences brand different methods and theories and approaches. I would like just to describe very briefly the main characteristics of these three parts. So the first part, call it Political Ecology and Agrarian Economy in Latin America, in which there is Andy Smolski article with Timothy Clark. It's much more a global view of the political ecology and agrarian economy in comparative perspective. So all these three first articles deal with comparisons between how agrarian economy had behaved, and what was the main dynamic and tensions between the agrarian economy and political ecology in different countries, in like an overview perspective. Also in territorial approach very focused on territorial struggles. The second part, I had already talked about it. It's about peasant indigenous territorial struggles. I would like to highlight this article from by Maria do Socorro and Lucineide Medeiros, that are both professors from Universidade Federal do Piauí. They deal with the concept of the last agricultural frontier, like the idea that this North province or state in Brazil represent agrarian experiences from the frontier between the most aggressive neoliberalism and the land concentration processes with indigenous communities and we can say non-capitalist zones inside Brazilian territory. And also they deal how the indigenous identity come up during this conflict. I mean, there are part of Piauí population in this territory of Gamela, they are studying, that were not identified as indigenous, self-identified as indigenous like 25 years ago. But this conflict with neoliberalism and also the legislation about indigenous territory create a conscious about their own identity as indigenous communities. And lastly, the third part had to do with agrarian neoliberalism and how financial power appropriate of the land, and that's also a very strategical topic. And I think that the book reviews are also interesting, film reviews from Christy and Thomas. So we have a very robust, I think, a very strong issue in terms of contributing and updating this debate.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that. I'm like many of our listeners, I'm very, very excited to read more of this issue and really get into it in more depth. We can leave it there. And yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming on today.
Thanks, Alex and Andy and Danny. Goodbye.
Thank you, Alex, for the invitation. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.
Well, folks, that is all the time that we have for today, but thanks for listening in. The January 2024 issue of LAP, The Agrarian Question as an Ecological Question, can be accessed online through our website, latinamericanperspectives.com, or on the LAP page with Sage Journals. If you like the show and want to receive information and updates about Latin America or content from our journal, please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on one of our many social media pages. And please, don't forget to listen to our next episode and rate the show. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.